Welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, celebrating 50 amazing years of AGNI Literary Magazine. My name is Lisa, and I'm a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time you're hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have all of you join our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of AGNI and an independent bookstore through your attendance. It's a pleasure to have you all here tonight. I'll now pass the baton to Sven Burkerts to introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Okay, hello and good evening. Welcome on the very last part of the Juneteenth weekend. I am Sven Burkerts. I co-edit AGNI with Bill Pierce. And this right now is the third of our scheduled 6 Zoomcasts, each one bringing together a member of our editorial staff with a writer who's published in AGNI for an in-depth conversation that ultimately, I think, celebrates the interaction of a writer and an editor, which many people don't realize is often, profound a creative event is a profound creative event unto itself. It's the behind the scenes thing, but there's truly powerful stuff that happens, and it's decisive. So we're doing this as part of our year-long celebration of our 50th year of publication, which never doesn't stagger me when I say that. A 50th celebration, which will be capped off in early November with a gala event at a venue which we will announce to the public soon, and which is going to feature a fantastic lineup of readers, including Joanne Beard, Teju Cole, and Victoria Chang, and others will be abundantly visually present as well. And we are already pretty excited about this many months ahead. Tonight, happy to announce a conversation between our fiction editor-at-large, Julia Brown, and AGNI author, Sara Majka. Julia came on board in 2019 and right away distinguished herself as an editor able to get deep into the life of a piece of writing and to help the writer bring it to full realization. Julia teaches at the University of Houston. She served previously as the editor at Gulf Coast magazine journal, and her work has been published in a number of literary journals, and she is currently at work on a collection of stories. Sara Majka, the author of Cities I've Never Lived In, published by the great, wonderful Grey Wolf Press, teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design. And though I didn't work with Sara directly, she was part of a team-taught workshop at the Bennington Writing Seminars, where I was very happy to read her in an earlier incarnation. So this is a kind of fulfillment moment in a sense. There will be time for Q&A later in the event, and some sort of signal will be given. And finally, we want to extend our serious thanks to both the Massachusetts Cultural Council and the NEA for their ongoing significant support. So I'm handing it over in turn now to Julia.
Excellent, Sven, thank you. Good evening to everyone, welcome. AGNI is 50, which is wonderful and amazing. And I'm happy to be celebrating that fact tonight with a writer I have long admired, Sara Majka. I agree with Salvatore Sciabona, who said of her collection, Cities I've Never Lived In, quote, "Every one of the sentences in this book is heavy with implication and insight. It is impossible to read these stories too closely." Love that quote. And Sara's story, The Riverbend Motel, was published in AGNI 93. So welcome, Sara. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you? Thank you.
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And thank you for your work. I'm a fan. I'm a fangirl, probably. We'll get into it. So I thought we would get started tonight by talking first about memory, because it plays such a substantial role in your work overall. I want to start tonight by just thinking about those words, I remember. I mean, if we go through the stories, they tend to begin with someone sort of calling back to a previous time in their lives. And that active recall becomes a kind of tool for self-discovery, maybe. But the events of the past are all still present somehow. So can you talk about memory's role in your work and why memory is such a fertile space for you creatively?
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently because I'm planning a trip to Nova Scotia. I haven't traveled in a long time because of the pandemic. And I planning it for August to go for a few weeks with my son. And I was like, oh, maybe, because I'm working on something right now. And I was like, maybe I can use part of that trip, what I'm working on. And I realized if I used it, how I'd use it is a memory, rather than writing it in the current timeline of what I'm working on. There's not much that I use. There's not much ever in my current timeline. And that the times that I've tried to write from that with the thing I'm working on now, it comes out really thin. But if I instead make that thing like a memory that I'm reminiscing on, even if it's a lie, because it actually just happened, it's part of the current timeline, but instead I put it in the past and it's more distant and it's a memory, it just works a lot better and it becomes richer material for me. And I'm not sure why, but I was thinking about that when I was thinking about the Nova Scotia trip, why that might be the case. I don't know why. If I write current timeline stories, they just don't seem to come to life and they seem really thin to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, with that sort of, I remember, like that, the event is sort of automatically privileged in a way, right? There's this layer of, okay, this thing that happened was important. And what I love about your work, how it uses memory, is that what's being remembered is not static. It's vital, it's important. Even if the protagonist is still discovering why, there is this sense of heat and importance and urgency, emotional urgency, right? The beating heart is there in every line. And so I just want to say, my first encounter with your work was the story Nashua. And I kind of remember sort of the quality of the light coming through the blinds as I was reading the story and being totally amazed by it. It contains so many of the elements I would see in your work. This, a female first person protagonist interrogating a sort of time in her life when she was house sitting and searching rural New England for abandoned farmhouses. Alice Munro gets a mention. Her work is sort of thought through for how it treats love. I mean, any mention of Alice Munro is, automatically like, two thumbs up in my book. And then this protagonist is remembering through an association with a man that she knew briefly and thinking on why it's important and wondering why it's important. That story just stuck with me. It stayed with me. And I was hard pressed for a long time to understand why, but then I came across an essay that you wrote for Catapult. And you said something that really resonated. And here you're talking about books that you picked out to teach your freshman comp students, in which there's some narrator writer crossover there. And these words really, really resonated with me. The essay says, "These books felt more immediate to me. When discussing the books in class, we weren't discussing well-crafted plots or narrative or character. Instead, we talked about a real human being, this writer-narrator, and how they might have come to this strange work of theirs. I would guess my attraction to those books has something to do with an alleviation of loneliness that comes from that proximity to a real person, though that may not be it. It's hard to say why this work means so much to me. You sense the cost of it. It is vulnerable. It feels necessary." And I read those words, and I'm just like, that's how I feel about the story. There's something about the quality of the self-questioning, the depth of insight, how elusive it is as well. And so I'm wondering about, about that alleviation of loneliness in your work as you're crafting it.
Yeah, I guess when I think about that, I think of it in terms of reading, because I was really shy when I was little, and along with a lot of writers probably, and we probably just all read it so much. And it wasn't really till I started to teach writing and literature that I found that I talked about the authors like a lot, not necessarily like their life, but just them on the page, like their spirit, within the page. And I hadn't really realized I had that tendency as a reader to really sense the writer themselves, sense them in the pages, sense their world and their worldview. And that, it's funny, you can be a reader for like 20 years, a passionate reader, and not really realize that's probably why you're reading. I mean, I liked stories, but more than that, it's someone with a really expansive worldview and maybe a lot of isolation and humor within isolation. And to spend that amount of time when I was young with someone who looked at life that way, that wasn't something I had experienced otherwise. And I think that was probably like the fundamental, one of the more important things in the way that I was brought up was that. And so I think I probably never lost that. With writing, I don't know how I think about that so much, but I know I get bored really easily, or I lose touch with the work really easily if it's not like, sometimes I wish pretty much all the time I wish I was better at like plot and character and scene. And so I'll put myself through the paces, to really do a plump scene, and characters and unless I'm really pivoting or doing something, I'm not that interested in things that happen maybe, or I lose the pulse of it really fast and it becomes really thin. So I have to always kind of, okay, what is in this for me, and how to go to someplace like, fast.
Wow. So you're chasing a pulse, really, is what I'm hearing. Like, does that, when you're creating the sentences and looking for that pulse, does that typically result in sentences that are formed very quickly or very more on the slow side and more deliberate? How does that affect your actual process as far as getting the sentences down?
Right. I'm a really fast writer once I have something, but it can be a few weeks before, I'm stuck and I'm frustrated, and, writing's really awful. And then then something kind of clicks for 3 days, and I only have to sit down for an hour and type fast, and then sit down for next day. So it comes out fast, but it's most of it's, not writing and being frustrated. But,
wow. That's terrific. So many of the stories take place in New England. Can you talk about your relationship to New England and what particular New England, or what about New England do you endeavor to capture on the page?
I know. Now you're from Virginia, but you're living in Texas. Have you spent much time in New England?
I have not spent much. I spent a couple of weeks, maybe four summers ago, in Portland, Maine.
Okay.
And on boats, traveling around looking at the lighthouses, and I've got the Portland headlight souvenir magnet on my fridge, and it just it's beautiful. It seems bountiful there in terms of food, just used bookstores, a ton of used bookstores. I think I stayed in an Airbnb that had maybe 4 or 5 used bookstores in walking distance. It seemed like a very magical place.
Yeah, my father was in the Coast Guard, so I was actually born in Kansas, but most of my life I was in different places in New England. And Yeah, it's just really where I'm from. And I wrote a lot of stories set in Maine, which is not so much where I'm from. I'm more from Massachusetts and Cape Cod, but with Maine, I could make it up a little bit more and it felt a little wilder and stranger to me.
Yeah. As far as location, I mean, there are these sort of New England locales that the stories are set in, but there's also a very interesting sort of island mainland dichotomy, and there are characters that are on the island, but it also they don't seem necessarily stranded, but it's a little bit more isolated if they want work or they want to sort of integrate themselves into something larger. Typically that involves moving to the mainland. So that's a very interesting dynamic that is very present in your work, that sort of island mainland dichotomy there.
Yeah, at the time when I was writing it, I started writing the book.
Mhm.
I had recently gotten married and he was an academic, so he got a position was it at Bates? That was the center of Maine. And so I sort of like fled the center. It was just for a year, but I spent a lot of time, in Portland and the coast. And I had lived there. My dad was in the Coast Guard, so I'd lived there just a tiny bit when I was young. And it really captured my imagination and changed my writing 100% that year. I think the stories got better. For some reason that year I spent there. So that was the start of the book. And then the end of the book, I had gotten a fellowship with the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown and spent 7 months there. And I'm grateful for that time as well. And Provincetown in the off season, I just spent a lot of times just kind of like at a bar in the afternoon, and you can just listen in on the fishermen and you go clamming and you can watch the locals. And I was from the Cape. Provincetown's at the tip of the Cape, but I was from near the bridge, so people in Provincetown don't want to hear that you're from that area if you're from close to the bridge. That's nothing to do with them. So I was very much an outsider as well during those months, even though I knew the Cape quite well. And it was, you're very sensitive to being an outsider kind of in a place you're from. It was an interesting experience for me, but watching them and being respectful to the life they led and trying to write about it without trying to take advantage of it.
Yeah. Have you spent much time away from New England or outside of New England?
Yeah, I lived in New York for like 5 or 6 years. I live in Providence now. I had my son about 6 years ago. Well, he's 6.5. So 6 years ago, I moved from New York to Providence. So I had that time in New York.
Wow. And it's interesting to note that the stories that have been written since the collection, a lot more of them are occurring in New York and outside of New England. So it's been interesting to watch that progression. Another repeat element in your stories is something that I come to call a sort of in-betweenness. Many of the characters are itinerant. They're between relationships. They're between residences. Settings are often inns and motels and places that are meant to only be stayed in for a short time. But it shows up in other ways too. For example, there are a lot of thrift stores. There are a lot of thrift stores in your work. And so particularly with clothing, but sometimes, just general shopping, it's like the item belonged to someone else and may at some point later belong to someone else. So this it's interesting kind of in between. Another thing I see a lot is in your work is a sort of general kind of disappearing. Something will happen and a protagonist will return or attempt to return to the place or to the person, and they were gone as if they were never there. And so I'm interested, it's as if the stories are trying to make statements about how much of life happens or is decided in these sort of in-between states, how much life is shaped in these periods between A and B. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think at the time when I wrote it, I think I had a real passion for travel and in between in those strange sort of spaces. My life is so different now when working on this next book is so different because I'm really settled here in Providence and I am a homeowner and I have, I'm a single parent of a 6-year-old. So I'm trying to recall those times back there. But, I think I felt really alive back then in those in-between places or meeting people, or sitting at a bar and getting to overhear the fishermen or watching the waitress out in Provincetown. And I sort of had this concept that life could kind of be strung along just with those moments, and it doesn't work, of course. But I do think at the time I really was taken, it felt alive, and a lot of like the regular day-to-day didn't. With a kid, that doesn't feel that way to me any longer, but I think sometimes it did back then.
Yeah. Wow. And so have you been able to do much traveling with your child or since you've had a child, and do the excursions that you have been able to take, do you feel a little bit of that old excitement coming back or that inspiration to write, or is it different somehow? Have things changed?
It's super duper different. I tried traveling with him like regular, and my book had just come out when I had him, so we traveled and we would end up in the hospital or something. Like on the West Coast, I got this huge eye infection, or we went to Ireland and he got the chicken pox, and and I was getting vertigo, and I just was like, this is too hard, and I stopped, and I never really restarted. We visited New York and he likes that, but nothing really. And so I'm pushing myself this summer, and the pandemic was what it was. So I'm pushing myself now to make the world bigger again and do it with him because he's older. And it's funny because travel was such a big part of my first book. Like if I was working on a story, now the Riverbend Motel does that a little bit because I was working on a story and I got interested in Mashpee, but that was easy to research because that's where I'm from and my parents still live there. But before I would get interested in, Portland, Maine or someplace else, and I would just get up and go and travel there, and I can't do that anymore. So I think that's why, I should look at Mashpee because that's easy for me to research. I can't just go up on a trip for 2 months around the country anymore. But then the pandemic, I couldn't even do that. So I noticed I had developed a bunch of like really weird passions, which maybe we all did, but I got wicked into the stock market. I got really into like online like forums, which is like was a strange place for me to go. And so I think a part of me really just wanted to go someplace different, and that was really different and probably a lot less rich of experience than traveling, but it was something.
What about the stock market intrigued you?
Oh, where to start? I don't even know. Like we all got into it a little bit, right?
Money moving.
What?
Money moving. Just something like
well, that. It is a real Wild West. It's probably a whole different conversation, but with my next thing, I am writing about it some. And I thought my second book might have a lot of that in it because I was so excited about it for a while. But I think it's more like 1 or 2 stories now. We'll have that.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned the Riverbend Motel, why don't we hear a little bit of it? And I want to first invite everyone to put your questions for Sara in the Q&A box. And so 15 minutes before we close, we'll start with that Q&A. So start thinking of questions or go ahead and write them, type them into the Q&A box. But Sara, why don't we hear these elements in motion?
Okay, great. And I should say a few thank yous too before I start reading, because it is fun to be at the AGNI celebration, because I know a bunch of you all. The story that I'll be reading, Riverbend Motel, was published by AGNI, and now I'm putting together a book, and this will probably be the first story, and it'll be a series of connected stories, and this will probably be the first one. And I worked a lot by email with Bill Pierce on editing it. And he's probably the most thorough editor of a story that I've ever had. And I'm joking, but I feel like I want to get you guys to publish every story in this future book just so it can be so cleanly edited. And I'm not just splashing praise. Like, it was very carefully edited, and I was very appreciative of that. And then Julie, it's been wonderful getting to know you a little bit, and Sven, I know, of course, from Bennington, and then also Askold, who co-founded or founded. He didn't co-found, he founded it. He was just like super founder. How can it be that he founded it 50 years ago? He must have been 10, right? That seems, he must have been a baby when he did it. But he was a real mentor to me at Bennington as well. So I am very thankful that I got to take part of that. And of course, thank you to Brookline Bookstore as well for hosting this, and for you all attending. I'm just going to read the first 5 minutes of The River Bend Motel. Again, it was published by AGNI. It'll probably end up being the beginning of the book that I'm working on. It's set in Mashpee, which is the town I more or less grew up in. I got interested in researching it, and it's the smallest little town in the world. We didn't even have it on Cape Cod near the bridge. We didn't even have our own high school. So I went to high school in Falmouth. And I never thought of it as a place of much import. It's never a place tourists go to. But when I was researching it, I found this amazing article about it in the New Yorker from 1978. It's written by Paul Brodeur, and it takes up like half an issue of the New Yorker back then, because the Wampanoag tribe is there, and there were a lot of land conflicts at the time. So it kind of blew my mind that there was like half an issue of New Yorker about the town I grew up in. So it really became quite interesting to me, and it was a bit of an influence with the story. Okay, I'm just going to read like 5 minutes of it. Back when my son was a baby, I used to divide the day into 2 parts, before and after his nap. And for each part, I came up with an activity. Sometimes we just did chores like buying groceries, but this time we were visiting the Cape, and so we drove to the flume to see if the herring were running. Once a year, they ran against the current in order to spawn. Usually you caught it at the beginning or as it was trailing off, and there'd be a fish or 2, elegant and slim. Some years, though, the whole flume was alive with them, as if the water was moving in a flickering mass. And then you could drop a net and catch dozens to use later for bait. Sometimes when I was young, we'd done that, filled a freezer with them, but that was years ago, and I had only thought of the flume again because of my son. An old man was there with a bucket full of fish. My son couldn't see any fish in the shadows, so we stood over the bucket. The man was neither kind nor unkind about it, but at last gestured that he was leaving. His vehicle was a pickup, the color putty, while mine was a new subcompact. Just then another man, he was Wampanoag, I knew right away, having grown up in that town, walked down in a fluorescent shirt and asked the old man what he planned to do with the fish. And right away, they were in the middle of a conversation both sides had been having for a long time. The old man ignored him, loading the fish in the truck. So the other guy kept talking and said he hoped he was eating them and not using them in his garden. The old man finally said, I've been doing this since before you were born, as if the Wampanoag man was a relative newcomer to the Cape. And then the old man added, get a job. The guy in fluorescent said that he had 2 jobs, but he didn't get as upset as I felt he might have, and instead kept circling back to the fish as if that were the most important and perhaps the only important thing to him. The fish that was slowly dying in the bucket. He said, you know, you're only supposed to catch them if you're tribal. The old man got in his truck and turned hard in the lot, while the other guy took pictures of the license plate with his phone. The whole thing brought my childhood back, where I'd lived down the street with my mother, though it had been a while since I'd thought of that time. We lived then above a store that sold alcohol and the kinds of groceries you made sandwiches with. An outside staircase climbed up to the roof, where our front door was usually open and the screen closed. I went to a camp one summer, and a volunteer, an older girl from town, walked me home, even up the stairs, but she stopped at the screen because of how ominous it made the apartment look. The camp was meant to give us somewhere to be because we'd had parents at work or someone drinking at home. When I was 12, we moved to a nice apartment in an old house on the curb, with the harbor down the street and some lilac bushes out front. My mother waitressed at a restaurant named for the flume where the locals went, and that was where she'd heard about the new place. My mom was a thin woman with feathery hair held back by clips that she kept in baskets on her dresser. She was pretty, but in a way common to the Cape, gentle, shrinking from the world on the other side of the bridge, living as she liked, which involved hard work at the restaurant, but also afternoons collecting shells and gluing them onto picture frames and making lanterns from colored glass and putting out milk for the cats. We ate dinner at strange times, somewhere between 3:30 and 5, depending when her shift started. And these were big meals: iceberg lettuce, sliced tomatoes, cold cuts or seafood, crab salad she bought at the market, bread from the bakery, jam that a friend made. I don't remember her ever cooking unless someone gave her seafood they'd caught, or she felt like making some pancakes in the morning. I'd watch TV after she left because I liked the noise and brightness, and then I'd fall asleep and wake to the sounds of her coming home. The routine only changed when she'd had boyfriends, which didn't last long, but it did alter things. One boyfriend was a fisherman, and then we had lobsters and buckets of clams in the fridge. Another one hunted, and we had meat in the freezer. One had a boat, and there were the three of us going around Buzzards Bay, me stuffed in a life jacket, sitting on a bench with my mother, hair whipping in our faces and the motion making sense impossible. The tallest worked on the Air Force Base and sometimes visited in uniform. He was eventually stationed to Texas, and there was talk of us moving with him, but we didn't. Mashpee was originally Wampanoag land and didn't have the colonial centers of the other towns. Growing up, there wasn't much except for a town hall and the package store and some small homes. We didn't have our own school, so I took a bus to the next town. Eventually, schools were built in an outdoor mall and cul-de-sac where young white families lived, and I moved away. When I returned, I discovered how beautiful the land was. Ponds and marshes were hidden by thickets covered in white flowers that climbed the trees, the bushes, everything, and blue herons and egrets perched in the trees or flew in sweeping circles around the water. I remember once before some reading or music event on the Cape, a woman asked me where I was from, and I said Mashpee, but it's my least favorite town. And she said, no, it was beautiful how it had once been. Can you imagine all those ponds? She said. Now I can, but I couldn't back then. That's about the first 2.5 pages.
Excellent. Thank you. So we hear a little bit about, and what you read, and how associatively the story is moving. Can you talk to us first of all a little bit about how you constructed that story? You mentioned the research that you did. And then, so when you sat down to write, did you begin where it begins? Did you begin with another part of it? How did the story come together?
I'm trying to remember. I was trying to remember that New Yorker article, if I had found it at the beginning or at the end of writing it. Now that scene at the flume, that one really happened. So I think that got me wanting to write about Mashpee.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it, isn't the case that it happened, and it's not based on my family, but it was a scene that I wanted to do something with. But gosh, I don't, I was trying to come back to writing at the time I wrote this. I had written a little bit since my son, but not a lot. I think I was just at the time thankful to be working on something. And I researched, I went into, use those microfiche or whatever it's called, because there was a murder I was interested in finding info about, but I didn't use that, though I'd still like to. And there's other stuff that I didn't get to use, but I'd still like to. And there was a strip club in Mashpee called the River Bend. And I actually went there as research. I dragged my sister and her husband to go and to see it. I was desperate to start writing again, and I felt like a little bit of the old interest in place. And so I was like, this is something I can start here.
Yeah. And the story, it's sly. I mean, we end up at a, yeah, you could call it either a sort of far away point from where we start, or a very, or very close to where we start. I mean, we start with this anecdote at the flume, and then the protagonist remembers living with her mother in this place, and then it becomes a story, a sort of origin story about how her parents met. But then it veers even further into meditations about the longings of the mother that then redound onto the longings of the protagonist. I think that last, that last section, it's like, I feel like I hear angels singing when we understand kind of why this protagonist has been telling the story and what it has to do with desire and longing and the bogs, and how that imagery has woven its way into the protagonist's consciousness. It's very beautiful. Thank you so much for entrusting us with that story. She's contending with her own longing in a way that makes me as a reader say, okay, this is where we've been heading all along. There's something really sly and smart about it. When you begin this, it feels like a journey to me. It reads like a journey. Do you have a sense of where you're heading? How much do you know when you start?
Yeah, I don't. I really have to be in the present with, I teach short story writing, and I really try to tell students, like, you really have to be open to the moment, because it's very comfortable for us to know what we want the story to do. I find myself even now doing it, like, I know what I want to have happen. I know the part that I want to write, and you have to be willing to, at a certain point, to let go of that. And I really push that with my students, and to be able to let go of the part that you want the story to do. And so I really do try to be in the moment. Like, I think a little bit I'm lucky that writing scenes and stuff doesn't come so easy to me, because I think if it did, I would just want to tell the old-fashioned story about the mom and the dad and how they met and had this child. But I'd lose, the writing gets super thin super fast. So I have to keep saying, well, what interests me, how to go to a place that feels richer to me. So I think that's why it moves associative, or it keeps switching and trying to go to a more intimate place, because that's my only way of staying attached to the writing. Yeah. And so I think the story is like an action of trying to keep attached to the writing and making it keep staying involved with it.
And do you find yourself editing a lot on the front end before you're sending it out? You mentioned that your writing process tends to go pretty quickly. And so editing included, do you find that you're doing that shaping?
I used to write whole new drafts, like with whole different things going on, and then laying them on top of each other like foundations.
Yeah.
And that much of the first half of my first book was written that way. But now I do find that I keep I have to clean up the sentences a lot, which is very time consuming, but that otherwise, and I'll delete some things, but otherwise it's mostly intact from the first draft, like structure wise.
Yeah. And you mentioned having a fantastic editing experience with Bill Pierce, who, yes, is an incredible editor. What were you seeing in your story post that process that it was what the editing kind of brought out in it that you weren't seeing before?
I just think how clean the copy was. But also, I really wanted to get in all the research. In one place, Bill thought, oh, this could maybe taken out. And I was like, oh, that's because I'm trying to jam in this research, because I don't want to let it go, because I want this to be what I wanted the story to veer into it. So that was useful. And it's a useful reminder in my head for the rest of the stories as well, because you want to kind of jam something in, because you spent 2 days researching it.
Right.
They can usually be taken out.
Yeah. I want to think a little bit about form. I've heard cities I've never lived in referred to as a story cycle, linked stories, but I wanted to ask you kind of how you conceive of your work and how it's connected. There are a lot of connecting details kind of woven throughout. And I'm wondering first, were the stories conceived with those details, or is that something that then gets added after your collection is assembled? How did that work?
It was a little haphazard because the first, I was a little bit of beginner writer with the first story, so I was just really glad to be writing stories. And then by the middle, I knew I wanted to put a book together, and the voice was similar through them. So the second half, they were written to connect, but the first half they weren't. So, but what I'm working on now, it's much more purposeful the whole time, that it'll all go together, which is easier.
Yeah. I mean, I've been reading a lot of your work the last couple of weeks, and I'm noticing that there, even in the stories post cities, there are also connecting details in some of those stories as far as names, a little bit location wise. And I wonder, do you feel connections, threads in the work overall? Do they feel like pieces of a tapestry, or is every story that you sit down to write sort of its own discrete entity that just gets the details that are maybe top of mind, or it's not as much of a conscious creation? Is it, or are the stories pieces of an entire tapestry that you see yourself putting together in a collection eventually?
Right, with cities I've never lived in, each one was a short story, like written entirely without thinking about the other things and meant just to be a short story. So it is definitely a collection of short stories. What I'm working on now, I call them stories, but they're probably chapters, but I get like, if I think about them as chapters, I get like scared and like freeze up. So stories I'm more familiar with, but sometimes when I'm stuck writing this, it's because I'm working too hard to make it a novel, or I'm working too hard to set up characters and plot for something that's going to happen where I want to go in the distance. And so I stop myself and I go, you can just write a short story, because then everything happens now, and you're not like, I don't know, I get weighed down when I feel I need to do a bunch of construction. But with a short story, you've got to be really present and in the moment, and it's fine, it can just end, and it'll probably attach in its own kind of organic way. So if I start putting pressure on myself with an idea of a larger work, and I'm just like, it's fine, it can just be a story. There's a lot of lightness in stories, and that it can be really in the present.
Excellent. Occasionally in workshops, there'll be a question about audience. Question like, who is this work for? Your stories are so intimate. They feel very private. I read your work, and sometimes it's like, it's the thing I love about it and appreciate about it, that it is so close. It is so human. I really almost feel like it's something I wasn't meant to see, right? It inspires admiration from me and closeness to me. It endears it to me. How much those stories privilege the eye and that deep investigation of the eye. And so it made me curious to ask you, what do you think about audience? How do you think about audience? Do you think about matters of audience? Maybe at some point in the process, you're thinking about the folks who will read and encounter your work. Where does audience fit into your process? Does it?
For cities I've never lived in, I was in grad school, so at Bennington, and I had close mentors there. And, I was in Provincetown and had close readers there. So I had a lot of relationships with people that really just inspired me. And I felt very full of these connections, and felt like I was probably writing for them, and, in this literary world with them. And for this book, I don't have that at all. And so I more probably had a reader in mind when I wrote the first one. and this one, I think I just can't even think about readers. I think it's like to think about this being read or God help me like reviewed, just like this is a work of like, you know, the isolation from the pandemic and from, you know, coming back to writing from being a mom. So to imagine a reader, I think I just, you know, you had a certain point, you just have to, if you can't handle the thought, you just don't think about it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering how that it changes your process to have had these mentors, that you had so much in mind while you were writing the first collection. And now, I mean, like you're saying, that that isolation is an important theme. Does isolation, physical isolation, aid in writing about actual isolation on the page?
It helps me. I like to kind of be in my own world. It helps me, you know. I was trying to think, I've sent my manuscript to just a few people, and I think maybe too much isolation is too much, because I'm just like, at a certain point, I'm losing faith in it. But I've sent it to a couple of people who are like, no, keep working on this, you know. And Bridget Hughes, who's at a public space, and she edited Cities I've Never Lived In, and she kind of okayed keeping work on this. So I've needed to make contact, you know, and a couple of friends have read it. I've needed to make contact to make sure I'm not crazy, you know. But other than that, I do like to be away from things to work.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's good time to send in your questions. We have a question from William Pierce. When you're putting together one of your collections or working toward it, is there a moment when the story writing tips from stories that assert themselves for their own reasons to stories that the collection itself seems to need?
Yeah, that's a wonderful moment when it happened. It happened to Cities I've Never Lived In. The last like 2 or 3 stories kind of wrote themselves, which never happens for me, but I already knew the characters and the locations and already had the events. So the last 2 stories just kind of were for the collection, and it's so much easier than starting from scratch. So yeah, that happens, and it's a godsend when it does, because then you have material, you don't have to find it.
That last story really does give the whole collection a roundness. And so
Yeah.
you're saying that was sort of born after the rest of it had been put together, and it just had its own momentum.
Yeah, it was the easiest thing. I was like, hallelujah, this is so easy, because you know, you have everything already.
Excellent. That's great. Please send in more questions. I have a few more here. Many of your stories make reference to artists. Writers, Alice Munro was mentioned, Sebald, Calvino, for example, but more so, I think there are even more visual artists mentioned. The first story in the collection is called Reverone's Dolls. He's Armando Reverone, I think he's Venezuelan, who created these uncanny, strange, because of that story, I ended up looking him up and seeing these incredible dolls that he made. But you also mentioned the Polish artist Magdalena Zawadzka, and I took a very pleasant tour through her work because of a mention in one of your stories. And there are even other artists that aren't referred to by name, but they're details of their lives that are often point of reflection for your characters. So can you talk about your relationship with visual art and how it inspires you?
Yeah, I think it's similar that when I was talking about that time in my life where I sort of like those in between spaces. I spent a bunch of time in museums, and they felt really alive to me. There's a lot of just strangeness there. If you think about museums, it's just like going to a space where you stare at artwork. But if you kind of think about it, it's a strange experience being there. You just are slowly passing through these large gallery spaces. You get in kind of like a weird state a little bit. There's a little bit of a church-like feel with the structure itself. And if the work is weird, you can feel quite strange. And I think that had a strong influence on me at the time, you know. And I would read articles. Like the Armando Reverone. I read an article in the New York Times, cut it out because there was an exhibit in New York And the same, what's his name? Paul Brewster, I forget his name, a folk artist that influenced one story. And so I'd read this article in the Times and then go, because I like to travel, I'd go to the exhibit and kind of like create this story that way.
Yeah. I want to talk about class a little bit. I've heard a couple times the word sort of hard scrabble in reference to a lot of the characters and protagonists in your stories. But I think that you're also doing something very interesting with class. There's one story, I think it is the title story from the book. The protagonist actually likes to travel around to go to soup kitchens. Sort of, making the decision to, I guess, get on buses and then travel around to soup kitchens and churches in different locations. And it speaks in an interesting way to class, right? To want to travel, right? In the story Nashua, I think there's the line something like, the protagonist was interested in both urban and rural poverty, and in a way that kind of speaks to her being sort of distant from that poverty on the outside of it in a way. So can you talk about class, socioeconomics, and how those things reflect in your work? I'm seeing all kinds of interesting levels there.
Yeah, I think maybe in some way that's my primary influence or primary desire to write. And I would have no idea why, it's not something I really think about. And probably that's my interest in New England, is looking at class in New England, the lower working classes in particular. And I wouldn't know why that would be the case. Now, the narrator of what I'm working on now in cities I've never lived in is definitely a version of me, right? But I always give her a working class, lower class upbringing, and a totally different upbringing than I had. My family was very much middle class. My dad was a dentist in the Coast Guard. So her mom's a waitress, a single mom waitress. I don't know why I do that. I don't know why. I honestly, it is like an area like I always want to dive in there. It's deep, and I'm not sure why that is.
Oh, look, we've got a few questions here. Okay, Lori Carson asks, can you talk about the magical element that happens in Boy with Finch? Did the idea for the story come from a painting?
Yes, and I'm blanking on the artist's name, but it is a folk artist who was deaf, and the New York Folk Museum Paul Brewster did a wonderful exhibit, and he would travel around Maine, forever ago. And he was kind of a little bit of a crude painter, which I like those early Americana crude folk paintings. But because he was deaf, he painted the eyes and really, really detailed. That's clearly how he would communicate. And he would painted children with these extremely strange expressive eyes. And if you walked into a whole gallery, as I did with all on the walls, these crude folk paintings of these children, but with such strange eyes, all talking, all the eyes were talking. It was a strange experience for me. And that story was entirely influenced by that painter and going to see that exhibit.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, Tehu, am I pronouncing it Tehu Cole? Mm-hmm. In Open City, he writes about that same exhibit. He has pretty much a whole chapter on it, which I didn't know until after. So if you go to his book, Open City, he has a whole chapter on that exhibit as well. Wow. So
It's a good shout.
Yeah.
Sam Warren asks, thank you for the reading and the wonderful questions. Can you talk a bit about the narrative voice? It almost seems like an essaying voice. We're watching the narrator work through ideas. An inept teacher might say there's lots of telling rather than showing. Anyway, I love cities and I'm looking forward to reading your next book.
Thank you. Yeah, I always, when I teach, telling is great, showing is great. It's just about, I think when people are saying, show, don't tell, they're really saying your details aren't, your details aren't there yet. But I like telling. I probably wish I was a different sort of writer than I am, because what I'm writing now is even more essay-like, and it's not the path I probably would have chosen, but it's what I guess I have an affinity for.
Great. I think we have time maybe for one more question before Sven comes back to see us out. Anonymous attendee asks, is it easier for you to write stories inspired by past times and places in your life, or places that are still part of your present?
The past. But the present, I'll use it as framing, like I have a son and we went to the flume, but I won't really go into the details that much, you know, but the past, yeah, I can write about a little easier.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I guess I'll ask, you mentioned that you sound pretty deep into the next collection.
Yes.
Do you have a time that you're shooting for having that ready, or are you still pretty deep in process?
I was hoping it would be done this summer, and it is profoundly not done this summer. So next summer.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, our questions are answered, and we're pretty close to time. So I'll thank you, Sara, for joining us today. Thank you all out there for attending. It's such a pleasure, Sara, to talk with you about your work. I love it. I love it, love it, love it. And thank you for it.
Thank you for your care with it, and for everybody coming, and for AGNI and another great 50 years ahead.
Excellent. Very good.
Sven, are you coming back?
I'm not getting video. Am I audible?
You're audible.
I'm audible. I might have to go audible on this. Nobody needs to see my face. I was thinking all along as I was listening that this may qualify me as a total literary nerd, but there's really nothing more interesting to me than listening to a thinking writer sort of getting into the material and being prompted to get further in by a really probing interlocutor. But I felt that tonight. So interesting. I love this stuff. So I'm going to close just on a note of, you know, great cosmic love. But I also want to say, also to reiterate my or our magazine's thanks to our sponsoring institutions, the Massachusetts Cultural Council and the National Endowment for the Arts, and to remind everyone that our next event is July 22nd, when our poetry editor, Jennifer Kwan Dobbs, will have a conversation with Kamiko Han, and that happens on July 22nd. So be there, and really thanks. This was so interesting to me, and I hope everyone has a inspired night. Go home and start creating rapidly. So thank you.